We'll get started. As you all know, I'm Sarah Anderson, one of the faculty here at the Bren School, and I'm pleased today to introduce Richard Ladle, who is here from us from the Federal University of Alagoas in northeastern Brazil. So he flew a long ways yesterday, but luckily came in yesterday, and he's back sort of on our time zone. He's also Senior Research Associate at the School of Geography and Environment at Oxford, where he got his PhD. She's going to teach me to hold this thing just right. Volume control. I need somebody sitting in the front row. All right. But just to he has really broad interests, right? His website says basically he has broad research interests ranging from the representation of conservation science in the media to the use of macroinvertebrates in stream biomonitoring. But just to make it clear how broad that research is, I took a quick look at his recent papers, and they included things like are compound leaves an adaptation to seasonal drought or rapid growth, and the evolutionary ecology of detritus feeding in the larva of freshwater diptera, and citations, poor practices by authors reduce their value in nature. So broad interests, and actually none of those is he here to talk to us about. Instead, he's here to talk to us about one stream of his research with titles more like Origins, Uses, and Transformation of Extinction Rhetoric. So thinking about how conservation science is represented in the media, and then in turn what this representation in the media means for the politics and for the policies that we get out of this kind of science. And I'm really pleased to have him here because this is a place where we train both scientists and hopefully communicators of that science. And so I think this is a really important topic for us to be talking about. And with that, let's welcome Richard Ladle.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's an absolute pleasure to be invited here. And thank you for your introduction. I think another way of saying it is that I have big problems with focus in my research. But I consider that as a plus point. Okay, so without further ado, what I'd like to do today is to introduce some of the scientific and representation issues that I'm interested in through a case study. And probably the effect is going to raise more questions than it actually answers. But as I'm going to repeat again later in the talk, I think that debate on these issues and debate about how we interact as scientists with the media and how media representations may influence the public, it's very, very important for us to be discussing these issues. So the structure of the presentation, first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change impacts on biodiversity, although I realize that many of you will have had courses on this, so I'm not going to go into it in any great amount of detail, other than to talk a little bit about the uncertainties involved. I'm then going to look at why study media representations. A slight change in schedule. I am going to do a case study on climate change and extinction in the media. The poor old golden toad has become extinct from the presentation because I realized I didn't have time to talk about it. Well, it's very interesting. If anybody would like to talk to me about the golden toad, I'd be absolutely delighted. Okay, so predicting the biodiversity consequences of climate change is difficult for a variety of reasons. Of course, there are a range of climate change scenarios, and these are becoming more refined and better all the time. There's also perhaps a bigger problem is the incomplete data set that we have on biodiversity, particularly global biodiversity. We don't know with any great amount of certainty how many organisms there may be on Earth. Probably somewhere between 4 and 10 million is the best guesstimate, but I've seen estimations anywhere up to 100 million. We also have problems with not knowing where these species are. This is sometimes called the Wallacean shortfall. So even if we know of the existence of a species, we don't have very good data on its geographical distribution often. We also have a incomplete knowledge of how changes in climate will affect species distributions. This is because we don't know the absolute tolerances of species to particular climate regimes. We also don't know how the new communities that form through climate change, the so-called non-analog communities, whether they are going to have the effect of excluding certain species or allowing other species to survive there. So that's also a very difficult aspect of the prediction. And finally, we rely on complex simulations, often bioclimatic models, that involve a large number of assumptions, some of the above ones included. I take this from a very recent paper. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend it very highly to you, by Pigeon and Flishoff. It came out at the end of March. I know they sound like a comedy double act, but it's a very interesting paper, Sources of Uncertainty, which talks about how interdisciplinary efforts are required for communicating climate change risks. And this is one of the figures from the paper, talking about some of the main uncertainties in climate assessments. I'm particularly going to be talking about these direct impacts, impacts of climate change on crops, forests and ecosystems. But it is also worth remembering that there are a series of other assumptions underlying these about before you get to predictions of how temperature may rise globally. And finally, of course, there's the final layer of uncertainty, but perhaps the aspect of most interest to the public, of course, is what the final socio-economic impacts may be of climate change. And in communication with the public, it is often these uncertainties that the public perhaps are most interested in and have greatest difficulty understanding. Okay, this is quite a scary figure, but it's not quite so bad as it seems. This is from a paper I wrote with a colleague of mine, Rob Whitaker, who's Professor of Biogeography at Oxford University. And this is Rob's figure, and he was particularly wanted to show how, when you have a model of climate change up here, how the inputs from the climate change model and the biological inputs are converted into the species losses, so extinction from climate change. So essentially, the model works like this. You have observed species distributions, observed land uses, observed climate, and you use this to create a model of the current bioclimatic envelope of a species. Now you can model how the climate may change, and you can extend that bioclimatic envelope into the future. Now it's quite possible that the future bioclimatic envelope and the current bioclimatic envelope are going to be in different places. In fact, highly probable for many species. And in this case, the species is going to be outside of its current bioclimatic envelope and may be committed to extinction. There's also issues of then using such range losses to species losses and trying to extrapolate that onto a lot of other species that we don't know about. So looking at how the ranges of habitats will contract, so for instance how forest may contract, and you can then convert that loss in the range of habitat to a loss in the number of species. Island, obviously basic biogeography, island biogeography theory, where you can go down the species area curve from a big habitat with lots of species to small fragmented habitats, each containing less species. So you can extrapolate from the number of species that are occurring in the large area of habitat to how many species will be occurring in the future in the small area of habitat that is left. So these are the techniques and tools that you can use to make best guess scientifically based predictions about the amount of extinction. And of course, within these sophisticated and exceedingly useful and interesting models, of course, you do have a lot of potential areas of uncertainty. Okay, so to reiterate, despite these uncertainties, these sort of predictions are exceedingly important because they may allow you to better place protected areas. They may allow you to identify species in very high-risk categories, identification of priority areas for increasing habitat linkages, linkages such as corridors, stepping stones, greenways. So essentially, they're giving you tools to help you to develop a much more focused conservation policy at all sorts of spatial scales, from local spatial scales all the way up to regional or global spatial scales. So incredibly important and useful tools. Also, these sort of predictions have the possibility of influencing public awareness about possible futures. Sometimes possible futures that are rather bleak, but have a considerable amount of rhetorical value. If they can influence public awareness, may be able to influence public opinion, and thus support for conservation action. Although I want to say at this stage that there is not a lot of empirical evidence that raising public awareness changes public opinion. And there is not a lot of studies, empirical studies, demonstrating that changing public opinion necessarily leads to people digging into their pockets and supporting important conservation organizations such as WWF or CI. So it's a difficult chain of logic and rather uncertain. In terms of communicating with the public, clearly, if we want to raise awareness or public understanding, the science needs to be placed into the public domain. And in order to do that, you have to translate the science, or somebody has to translate the science. And we'll come back to this issue of who should be translating the science, and whether indeed scientists are the best people to be doing this, which is also a subject of debate. It needs to be translated into forms the public can understand. This can be through press releases, often written by scientists or press officers at universities. This can be converted into newspaper and magazine articles, often normally written by journalists. And of course, there are other new media forms that are becoming more and more important for where people get their information from. There was a recent study, for instance, showing that blogs were becoming increasingly important for younger demographics to get their information about the world, full stop. Although, having read some blogs, that's quite a worrying thing for older gentlemen such as myself. There's also, of course, we can't forget very powerful forms of media such as radio, television, movie theatres, and traditional forms of communication such as public seminars and the like. So, to go back to one of my original questions, why is studying media representations interesting, potentially important? First of all, it gives insights into public understanding of conservation science, and it also gives insights into how journalists interpret conservation science, which is also interesting if you have any dealings with the media. It can reveal underlying agendas of different conservation actors, because often news stories or representation on the internet, you have important conservation actors such as conservation scientists in universities, such as big NGOs, private individuals. Another, I think, interesting aspect is media representations provide insights on how different conservation issues are framed, such as how are these conservation issues being aligned with specific agendas. Now, the golden toad, which I promised you I wasn't going to talk about, is one of those cases where I don't know whether perhaps some of you haven't heard of the golden toad. It's a small species of beautifully coloured amphibian that was only found in a small area of the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica. And it went extinct in the early 90s. And we can be pretty sure it went extinct because it was quite easy to count. And not because it was bright golden in colour, but because it spawned in specific streams every year. So every year the scientists could come out. They're very, very convenient. Most animals don't do this, for any of you who have done field work. It came out and showed itself so that you could do a good count of it. So we know it is extinct. But what is interesting is that the story, the narrative, and the representation of the golden toad in the media has slowly come around to align itself with the climate change agenda. So now the golden toad is very much an iconic, it's almost a flagship species for climate change. It is often quoted as being the first victim of climate change. Okay. Another interesting aspect is, of course, the media representation could positively or negatively influence public opinion about conservation issues, about government or NGO policy, and could potentially influence public opinion about scientists as well. And the main reason that I'm here in Santa Barbara is to become involved in a really fascinating project where we're going to be starting to probe at some of these questions and try potentially to link representation with public opinion, with actually public behavior in terms of how people vote, which ultimately will influence policy. So although these links have a degree of uncertainty about them, one of the reasons for this, of course, is there's been so few empirical studies. So this will be filling a really interesting gap. For the social scientists in the audience, it's also worth noting the relationship between knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. Oh, hello. That was interesting. Sorry, hit the wrong button. That there are theories out there trying to explain these relationships, things like the theory of reasoned action and theory of planned behavior, neither of which have gained a huge amount of empirical support, but act as a useful framework for reference when you're looking at how information may influence public opinion, how public opinion may influence individual behaviors. There's also another theory known as the deficit theory for explaining why public awareness is so important. This is the assumption that there is a deficit in awareness of issues, and if you can fill that deficit in public understanding with your press release or with your media strategy, that this will influence public attitudes and behavior. Once again, hardly any empirical evidence for this. If there is any evidence, it's actually that the deficit theory doesn't actually work very well. Okay. So now moving on to the meat of the presentation. Why is it interesting to study media representations of extinction? Well, first of all, extinction is a very poorly known process. So there's lots of room for interpretation. E.O. Wilson, perhaps the most famous living conservationist, said that extinction is the most obscure and local of all biological processes. It is also geographically situated. I'm very, very aware, living in Brazil, that the biodiversity crisis is affecting and is going to affect some countries far more than others, Brazil being one of them with its mega diversity. And also, extinction has different meanings with different types and degrees of agency with the public. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago trying to identify these different potential meanings of extinction as applied to biological species. And I came up with at least 6 different meanings to extinction that are commonly used. Perhaps one of the most important meanings, and one of the meanings that we're going to that creeps up in media representations again and again, is what I refer to as Linnaean extinctions, and Wilson calls centenarian extinctions, which are these extinctions of undiscovered species observed from the species-area relationship, with using estimates of species diversity for a given ecosystem. So, for instance, we don't know how many species are in the Amazon, but we know how fast the Amazon rainforest is contracting. So we can estimate the number of species, which is many times greater than the number of species we actually know. And then we can look at the rates of deforestation, the rates of decline in the area of the habitat, and we can predict how many species out of these species that we don't know exist, but we predict are going to exist, will go extinct. So whenever you see things in the media saying there is one species going extinct every 3 minutes, it is highly likely that 2 out of every 3 of those species, or 4 out of every 5 of those species, have never been discovered. They are hypothetical species. They almost certainly exist, but we don't know what they are. But that's interesting. That's interesting in its own right. Okay, so what is the potential agency of these Linnaean extinctions? These are the big headline figures that you see. Perhaps the biggest, and also the headline figure with the least accuracy, is Norman Meyer's prediction from 1979 from the Sinking Ark. He said that 40,000 species go extinct every year. And that was actually based on a guess. But a more respectable figure is E.O. Wilson's prediction from his book, The Diversity of Life. Fantastic book if you haven't read it. He suggests, based on species-area relationships and decline in tropical rainforest habitats, 23,000 species going extinct per year. How many of you could, just out of interest, how many of you could name 10 species that have gone extinct this decade? Yeah, yeah. Talking to the students here, I don't want any professors giving me any grief here. Right. So this is interesting. I think this is interesting. You see 23,000 species. And I don't know whether you saw the quote at the start of my talk from Orton from 1869, writing about the decline of the great auk. And in this article, he says that the loss of a species is more important than the loss of an. It's a bigger event than the loss of an imperial dynasty. But clearly that importance is lost on a considerable amount of people. But, okay, potential agency. Clearly these big figures, 23,000, 40,000, they construct to make credible the notion of the 6th mass extinction event, an important rhetorical tool. They make extinction relevant in a range of international policy areas, agriculture, forestry, health, thereby contributing to what we might term the mainstreaming of conservation and biodiversity into international policy, something which the great conservation organisations such as CI and WWF are extremely competent at doing, and influencing international policy, influencing international conventions. And these sort of figures have great agency in those sort of debates. And also, these figures create a sense of urgency in crisis that can be used to raise funds and to legitimize action. Okay, so this is a case study that I would like to talk about, which is newspaper and new media reporting of climate change and extinction. And it stems from perhaps the most widely reported scientific paper on climate change and extinction of the last decade. And important both academically and in the wider context. This paper has had more than 1,000 citations. Before I talk about that, however, forgetting what slide comes next, just want to talk a little bit about how conservation science becomes news. You have the generation of your scientific content, normally turned into peer-reviewed publication. In this case, it was a paper in Nature, sometimes released as grey literature. This is often converted into a press release, or can go through a news agency such as Reuters and become a news wire. And then it gets turned into a feature item within a newspaper, which combines information from the press release, the news wire, interviews, sometimes actually referring to the peer-reviewed article, but not very often. I've spoken to many journalists, many environmental and science journalists, and they hardly ever read the original article, which you have to bear in mind when you're reading their feature item. Okay, so this paper, so probably the most important paper, and certainly the most cited paper ever written on extinction and climate change. So I had a look on number of citations on Google Scholar a couple of days ago. 1,701. My H-index, if I had a paper like that, would be sky high. But unfortunately, I don't think I will ever get to those heights. So this was a paper within the most important, with respect to science, perhaps not the most important, the joint most important science journal in the world. Nature or Science. If you have research that is really important, then it is published either in Nature or Science. So immediately you're getting high publicity for your work. And here's a summary of the results using sophisticated bioclimatic envelope modeling. Under moderate climate change scenarios, between 15% and 37% of the 1,103 organisms considered within the study would be committed to extinction. If you remember, committed to extinction, living outside their current bioclimatic envelope by 2050. The scientists take pains to point out decades may elapse between area reduction and extinction. This is very important. Committed to extinction does not mean extinct. It means that technically, that all other things being equal, we would expect these species to eventually go extinct. The full range of predictions for the models, and you've got to remember that there are all sorts of, the models, every time you add an extra layer of complexity, you're potentially adding more uncertainty, therefore a greater range of unpredictability. So the full range of predictions was 5.6 to 78.6%. There's also no mention of 1 million species. The reason why I'm saying that will become apparent very, very soon. Okay. So, headlines. Climate change threatens 1 million species with extinction. As you imagine, I was the director of the MSc in Biodiversity and Conservation at Oxford at this time, and I used to take a bus into work from a little village about 10 miles out of Oxford, and I'd always stop off and get a coffee to take with me. And I picked up the newspaper, and this was the front cover of the newspaper. I literally nearly spat my coffee out on the back of the man sitting in front of me. Other things in the press release: a quarter of land and animal plants may go extinct. Extinctions will occur eventually. This is important. Not in the following 46 years. So the press release introduces this notion of 1 million species, but it does not say that the extinctions will occur. Here are some of the news wires. Between 15 and 37% of animal species sampled in 6 critical world ecological regions could become extinct by the year 2050 because of their inability to adapt to changing climate. Global warming could wipe out a quarter of all species of animal plants on Earth by 2050. We're starting to get very scary numbers and very scary representation here. That was the headline that I read on the bus: how global warming will cause extinction of 1 million species. This is a UK broadsheet. This is another UK broadsheet: global warming to kill off 1 million species. Hello. And here's a quote from another broadsheet, The Times: 1 million species or more could be extinct inside 50 years. As soon as I got to Oxford, I went to the shop and bought all of the newspapers. Simply because I was interested in what the newspapers were saying and how they had misread the story. US coverage: cost of global warming, 1 million species. Dire warming warning. Bit of a tongue twister there. For Earth species, 25% could vanish by 2050 as the planet heats up, from the San Francisco Chronicle. I wrote a small correspondence with a couple of my colleagues in Nature, basically reviewing the newspaper representation in the UK. And I found that you had various levels of misrepresentation. 1 million species to go extinct occurred in 14 reports. Species extinct by 2015, 10. Quarter of all life forms exist in 1 paper. Quarter of all land, plants and animals in 7 reports. A third of all species extinct in 2 reports, and a third of all land animals and plants extinct in 1 report. Richard Pearson, who is Director of Biodiversity at the American Museum of Natural History, has recently, in his book on biodiversity and climate change, he redid the study among global newspapers, and he found very similar results to this. Okay, so what happened with respect to how was this information then used? Did other actors get involved, and did these actors use the very carefully thought out and written primary scientific information, or did they tend to use the media representations? This came out immediately after the paper came out. It was WWUK sent a conservation emergency that said, you've no doubt seen the recent press and television headlines: by 2050, global warming could wipe out 1 million species of animals and plants. And on the back of it was your form to give your $20 to WWF UK. Okay. I spoke to the head of WWF UK about this and asked him why he'd done it, essentially. At a public meeting he was giving in Oxford a couple of weeks later. And he wasn't very happy about me asking, and I felt rather intimidated by the reaction of the audience, who weren't very keen on me asking either. But it was very interesting. You know, essentially he didn't have an answer. I asked him why he used this information, and didn't he have experts to check? And he essentially didn't give me an answer. But I think it's very interesting, and it's also very dangerous when you're confusing media representation and science, especially when you're a science-based organism. Perhaps Freudian, a science-based organisation. The politicians, British politicians and European politicians also got involved. Margot Wallström, who was the Environment Minister at the time, said many people had a lot to say about the recently published study that suggests global warming could wipe out a third of the planet's species by 2050. And here's another more measured quote from Margaret Beckett, who was the UK's Environment Minister at the time. Once again, talking that the species in the area that was studied. So you can see she has obviously had much more technical advice on how to phrase this to the British Parliament. 15 to 37% of land species in the area that was studied could face extinction by 2050, but still saying by 2050, rather than talking about the full timetable. Okay, this caused me sleepless nights, I don't mind saying, and made me question. Actually, it made me question that I should have even done the research in the first place. Really fascinating correspondence, and you can go back and of course read these correspondences. Title was Extinction Risk Coverage Worth the Inaccuracies. I don't know whether Lee Hanna is here because I don't know what he looks like. No, he's not here. Thank goodness for that. Well, no, not thank goodness, because I think it's a debate that's really worth having. Is the misrepresentation worth it in terms of raising awareness about these issues? I am on the side of saying no. And in fact, my MSc group at Oxford, every year I would get them to do a debate where we had two people arguing that it was worth the inaccuracies and two people arguing that biased media coverage is never worth the misrepresentation. Generally speaking, the majority was always on my side, and I did try to keep my opinions to myself before we had this debate. But the majority of people thought that misrepresentations were too dangerous in terms of influencing public trust in scientists, and that we have to take the high ground on this, and we have to be absolutely explicit, and especially if we're representing organizations, important organizations such as universities, or important conservation organizations such as Conservation International. I also had okay, so that was the general argument. Awareness raising may be more important than accuracy in some circumstances. I also received an email via a friend of mine from Chris Thomas, the lead author of the article, suggesting that pointing out all of these media representations may play into the role of anti-environmentalists. So it could be that by pointing out how bad the press coverage was, that I was encouraging anti-environmentalists who are particularly active in the United States, of course. So I wanted to have a look at this. I wanted to see whether, there was two reasons for looking further afield onto the internet. The first one was I wanted to see how this misinformation had spread out into the wider media. And I also was interested to know whether the stuff that I had written was actually being used by the anti-environmentalists. And it was rather scary doing this for many reasons. The first one is that the first article that I came across was an Argentinian anti-environmentalist site with the image, a delightful image, cartoon of a panda with a human skeleton arm in its mouth. And my correspondence from Nature translated into Spanish without my permission or Nature's permission. So it's scary. So what we're thinking is that you know, the journal article, if you want, it's like a stone being thrown into the media pool, and the ripples spread outwards. And what we're looking at is the final layer of media representation here, the internet. I used Google, Yahoo, and MSN. I used the search term Thomas, climate change, extinction. I excluded sites that didn't provide any interpretation, such as Nature, which were just giving the paper. And I split the websites into various categories. I searched the first 50 sites and recorded the rank, so you know where they came up in the searches. And then I created a weighted rank across the 3 search engines based on recorded usage. Because there's studies that have shown that basically after the first 5 pages, so the first 50 results for any search, people stop searching. So it's important to know which things come up early on search engines. The results were that the majority of websites talking about these things were either media sites, so your sites from the newspapers, or non-profits, which include NGOs and some anti-environmentalist advocacy sites as well. Okay, 55 sites found, 33 US-based, 10 UK-based, 16 appeared on the top 50 in all 3 search engines. 19% were critical of the science in the Thomas paper. 42% say species extinct by 2050, so repeating some of the same misrepresentations in the media. And 37 used million species or more estimate. Okay, what's interesting for me is none of the anti-environmentalist sites, these are organizations that most environmental scientists, myself included, would be very critical of, but they gave the most careful coverage of the article, which surprised me immensely, and it's still something that I don't quite understand. But I thought they would be attacking the easy target, which was the media misrepresentation. And they weren't. They were attacking the science based in the original paper, which is fascinating. So here's the top 10 sites, just for interest. Leeds University press release came out first, followed by Conservation International report. Conservation International scientists were figured very highly in both the study and in promoting the results of the study. And then we have, in the top 10, we have 3 anti-environmentalist websites. Center for the, I really like the titles of some of these anti-environmentalist websites. They sound so academic and so sciencey, I suppose you'd say. Science for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change, Science and Environmental Policy Project, CO2 and Climate.org. You'd go into these sites looking at the title thinking that they were going to give you good unbiased information on climate change. And if you know a little bit about climate change science, you come out of the sites thinking these people are seriously misinformed and have a really, really strong agenda of their own. So I thought this was quite interesting. There's also a couple of kind of weird sites as well. Earth Crash, Earth Spirit, which is a personal website. Kind of interesting. Okay, so here's a few observations about these studies in general. Okay, complex science with high levels of uncertainty is targeted by anti-environmentalists. That's clear. And the anti-environmentalist representation is a minority, but punches above its weight in search engines. These people are sophisticated and savvy. It's difficult. In a sense, they play an important role of keeping scientists true to the cause and preventing, perhaps you would hope, preventing misrepresentation. Media sites generally new media sites generally as uncritical as print media such as newspapers. Political, especially right-wing sites are very active in reporting and interpreting environmental stories. It's impressive how quickly these anti-environmentalist sites churn out commentaries on peer-reviewed science. Quite scary as well. NGO and environmental charity sites are also quick to use the research to promote their message. And European websites and South American websites are quick to translate and discuss English language publications. So there is a strong effect in the global new media. Should also, so before I try to vaguely grope towards some conclusions of this sort of work and the message of this particular case study, it's worth talking a little bit about some of the wider contexts here. Okay, the first of all is that it is difficult to write a press release. It's difficult if you're a scientist. The paper by Pigeon and Fischhoff says that most people considerably overestimate their ability to communicate with the public, especially scientists. We think we know what they want to hear, but we're very bad at doing it. And often this is because there's some very value-laden language in environmental science. Even words such as pristine, fragile, alien species, they all have strong values, meanings associated with them, a kind of Garden of Eden mentality. And using this sort of language in an attempt to dumb down and to talk to the public may not be pulling the right emotional strings. And emotion is a very important aspect of this sort of communication if you want to advocate particular behaviours or action. My favourite I haven't put on here, which is virgin rainforest, which conjures up all sorts of strange meanings. And it's interesting that they don't use the converse. I've never heard of anyone talking about easy rainforest. Okay, or even slutty rainforest, but I think that's maybe going down too low. Right. Another context is trust in science. Because ultimately, it may be that misrepresentation of science leads to an eroding of trust. It worries me now that there has been such high-profile headlines repeated over the years. I occasionally go back into the media and search to see who's been repeating the 1 million species. How can we now come up with a new, more refined prediction for, say, maybe only 50,000 species will be extinct by 2050? Yeah, it has no value at all once the 1 million species extinct by 2050 has seeped into the public consciousness. So we have to be very, very careful about this sort of representation and very careful to try to correct these misrepresentations, however painful that may be. In terms of trust in scientists, scientists are trusted. And it's a privileged position and one that we need to maintain and to feed. 2 in 3 adults generally trust scientists to tell the truth. That means 1 in 3 adults doesn't believe us at all. By the by. So, sorry, 1 in 4 do not, and the remainder are undecided. I always put this up because I like there's a couple of interesting aspects of this. This is trust in professions from the Royal Society survey. I think what's particularly interesting is journalists, only 13% of people think that they're going to tell the truth. But television news readers, who are journalists who wear ties and read the news, 71% of people think that they're going to tell the truth. Okay, interesting. And scientists, we're sitting just underneath clergymen and above police. And slightly above the man in the street. Anyway, okay. I particularly like this quote from Colin Blakemore, who's a British neuroscientist who has had all sorts of run-ins with both the media and with animal rights activists. So he's very sensitive about portrayals of science and scientists in the media. He says the trend towards consultancy, startup companies and protecting intellectual property and so on is important for the economy of the country. But it does produce a dilemma that there are very few truly objective scientists left who have no other motive than the purity of scientific evidence. It is exactly those people that the public want to turn to most. Okay, let's go back there. It's a pity that Lee Hanna isn't here because I really wanted to ask him a question, which is whether he felt that belonging to Conservation International compromised his ability to talk about the science in completely independent fashion or not. Because conservation is about values. And organizations such as WWF and CI and TNC, organizations whose agenda I support, but they have an agenda. And the scientists who work for them may feel obliged to support that agenda. So are they giving impartial advice? It's a difficult, I'm sure they are in most cases, but it would be interesting to hear a senior member talk about it. Here's another context, which is probably of very general interest to everyone here, which is how climate change has become a dominating agenda within conservation science. I would extend this, a dominating agenda within environmental science. This is the number of papers which mention climate change and biodiversity in the title or abstract, biodiversity and sustainable development in the abstract, or sustainable development and climate change in the abstract. And you can see that since 2003, the number of papers that talk about climate change and biodiversity have increased exponentially. Climate change now dominates issues of biodiversity. For me, this is worrying as a conservationist. The biggest threat to biodiversity globally, and in the country I live, Brazil, is habitat loss. This is difficult to deal with because it involves development, industries, economics. Climate change is going to have its effect on biodiversity in the future. Are we missing the boat here? Are we looking in the future and are we forgetting what the dominating agenda for biodiversity is today through our obsession on climate change? A cynical person, not me obviously, might say that it is far easier for governments and big NGOs to try to tackle climate change, a problem of the future, than it is to deal with messy real-world issues of today. Interestingly, going back to media representations, I did a study a couple of years ago looking at representations of Amazon deforestation in the Brazilian media and in the UK media. And fascinating differences. In the UK, the emphasis was on ultimate causes, which were things like population growth and particularly the demand for soya and beef from the international market, developed countries, the US and European countries. And in the Brazilian newspapers, the focus was on development and sustainable development within the Amazon and how we can achieve economic growth while reducing the amount of deforestation. So, I mean, a completely different focus and nuance to the articles. There was barely any articles in the Brazilian media that even mentioned extinction, which I found interesting. A little aside, because it's amusing, there was Greenpeace in the UK did a big campaign against genetically modified soya. in fact, in the whole of Europe. The biggest producer of genetically modified soya being the US. The biggest producer of organic soya being Brazil. So everybody, you had lots of people switching to organic soya, and the land barons of Brazil hoeing down rainforest all over the place to plant soya to meet this new demand for organic soya. So it's interesting. These things, it's a complex and difficult thing to do to build a good strategy. So finally, this would be my kind of summary of these issues, is that if we look at climate change and the extinction crisis, we're finding that the model precision, climate change models have a much higher precision than the extinction crisis, because there are far fewer uncertainties. As I said earlier, we don't know how many species there are. We don't know the geographic distribution of species. And then, of course, if you add climate change models to extinction models, you get an even higher amount of unpredictability. However, the media representation of climate change is less certain. And there's good evidence. There's been several excellent papers written showing that there are some sections of the media, particularly in the US, who try to overemphasize the uncertainties of climate change science. But with the extinction crisis, the newspapers appear to be doing the opposite thing, which is they seem to be underemphasizing the uncertainties and shortening the timescales here, presumably to make a good story. I mean, that's what it boils down to. The perceived costs, of course, for climate change are personal and immediate. We have to change our lifestyle. We have to change what we're doing. Society needs to change. Government needs to change. Whereas the extinction crisis, of course, is impersonal and spatially distant. The problem is over there, Brazil, Indonesia, where the wealth of the global biodiversity is situated. And the perceived responsibility for climate change is the developed world, and the perceived responsibility for the extinction crisis is the developing world. And my experience in both, of course, these things are immensely complicated, but my experience is that the developing world, the media representation, tends to play down and ignore the extinction crisis, and whereas this is definitely a bigger story in the developed world, whereas climate change, the opposite seems to be true. Okay, so you might say, is disassociation of personal action from environmental consequence leading to polarized representation in the media? I think it probably is. So my argument would be that, first of all, uncertainty is central to climate change coverage. As scientists, if we're climate change scientists, we need to talk about the uncertainties. We certainly should never brush them under the carpet. Uncertainty is often lost during translation of conservation science into feature articles. The personal cost of climate change remediation is to be paid primarily by developed countries. So whereas the personal cost of species extinction is to be paid primarily by developing countries. And the media reflects personal concerns of readership and societal inertia for lifestyle alterations. So we're finding that the media represents more or less the feelings of the people, and the media does not want to lecture people to change their lifestyle, because if you're trying to advocate things like that to an unwilling readership, they're not going to be your readership for very long. You could say that, yeah, to put it another way, the threat of future extinctions does not require people to give up their SUV. Whereas the threat of more immediate things, such as perhaps more tornadoes, for anyone who watched the news this morning, may influence people to give up their SUV. Okay, this was just a couple of slides left, I promise. This was the conclusion I made from my 2005 paper on the internet representations. First of all, that science and the media are not independent spheres of activity, and they interact to generate and perpetuate a sense of crisis framed with a number of overarching environmental paradigms. These paradigms influence our teaching in schools and universities and influence our approach to scientific issues. While it is easy to understand those who agonize over any weakening of the argument for improved conservation funding and prioritizing, as a result of public discussion of uncertainty, scientists and conservationists should be wary of the potential damage to the science of ecology and of biodiversity research from potentially lazy reporting and misrepresentation. And the conclusion of Pigeon and Frischhoff: each communication failure makes future success less likely by eroding both the public's trust in the experts, who seem not to know their needs, and the experts' trust in the public, which seems unable to understand the issues. And I think they've cut to the heart of what we have to deal with here. Okay. If you want more information about the underlying biodiversity science and the uncertainties in biogeography, this book, Conservation Biogeography, just came out last month. At the same time, Richard Pearson also published a book, Driven to Extinction, The Impact of Climate Change on Biodiversity. Chapter 6 is about media representations. And I can't finish without saying what Pigeon and Frischhoff's conclusions were. Their conclusion is that we need to create interdisciplinary teams of scientists, social scientists, decision scientists, and perhaps with a smattering of anthropologists and other disciplines in order to tackle climate change representation and communication properly. And I think one of the great things about the project going on, about to start, is that that's exactly what it's trying to do, so I have very high hopes for it. Okay, thank you very much.
We're almost out of time, but maybe you can run out if you need to, and we'll take maybe one question, and then if you have more, you can swing down and ask Richard yourself. Does anybody have a question? Andrew?
Or comment?
Yeah. I guess the question is, and this is sort of what happens with the debates that you said you modeled, are scientists putting themselves at a disadvantage in an arena where public opinion is largely defined by misinformation? Are scientists putting themselves at a disadvantage by always holding themselves to a higher standard than their opponents?
Yeah, and I think that's why we need, I think they probably are, and I think that in a way should be why we need people to bridge between scientists. In a way, scientists should have very limited exposure to most scientists should have very limited exposure in terms of, or limited parameters within which they're working with the media, because there are experts in communication who are maybe better placed to do this. And there are so many dangers of good, well-intended but poorly conceived communication. I'll give you an example which possibly some people won't like very much. Al Gore's film, The Inconvenient Truth. They did a big survey after it had been shown in Germany, and they found that the people who had been to see The Inconvenient Truth were less likely to believe that anthropogenic climate change was happening after they'd seen the movie. So we need to be very savvy, and I think the important thing is to we need more evidence. We need to see which communication strategies work and which ones don't, and we need to create some sort of adaptive cycle of iterated modification of communication. Society is always changing, and we need to be monitoring which communication strategies work and we need to be modifying our communication strategies based on this empirical evidence. And I genuinely believe that's the only way forward to better communication, and for scientists to think a little bit more carefully before writing their own press releases, maybe.
Thank you, Richard. And if anybody has further questions, feel free to come down.
Yeah, thank you very much.